In 1875, the frontier was a slaughterhouse for the womb. Before she felt the first contraction, she tasted the metallic tang of liquid mercury on her tongue, a silver executioner she welcomed with open arms. On the Wild West, a woman didn't choose life or death, she chose which poison would rot her from the inside first. The dawn of 1870 did not break with the golden, redemptive light so often depicted in the pastoral oil paintings of the era. Instead, it arrived as a pallid, sickly gray smear across the horizon of Kansas and Wyoming, struggling to penetrate the thick, stagnant atmosphere of the sod houses. Inside these cramped dwellings, the air was a suffocating soup of unwashed wool, rancid bacon fat, and the pervasive, iron-sweet odor of a shallow privy located a mere 10 paces from the front door. This was the true sensory reality of the frontier, a place where the majestic silence of the plains was constantly punctured by the wet, rhythmic coughing of the sick and the frantic buzzing of flies over unemptied wash bowls. In this cradle of American exceptionalism, the female body was stripped of its humanity and reduced to a crude biological engine, a fleshy machine destined for the endless reproduction of labor. The expanding empire possessed a gluttonous appetite for human material, requiring a steady supply of sons to break the soil and daughters to maintain the hearth. Each woman was effectively a state-sanctioned vessel, an organic factory whose primary output was the cannon fodder necessary for the march of manifest destiny. There was no room for the luxury of agency or the sovereignty of the self, there was only the cold, mechanical requirement of the species to propagate itself across a landscape that remained stubbornly indifferent to human survival. The relentless spread of civilization functioned like an aggressive, invasive virus, turning the wild indifference of the prairie into a structured nightmare of property and production. This societal organism demanded new hosts to sustain its momentum, yet it offered its female subjects nothing but the crushing weight of duty and the constant threat of biological ruin. For a woman living on the knife edge of the frontier, every sign of a missed cycle was not a cause for celebration but a terrifying harbinger of a potential death sentence. In an age where the concept of antisepsis was treated as a fringe theory by many and ignored by most, the interior of the body was a dark, lawless territory where infection reigned supreme. Hygiene was a concept that existed only in the abstract, far removed from the grit and grime of the high plains where water was often a brackish luxury and soap was a harsh, caustic necessity. Dysenteries and various internal fluxes were the constant companions of the pioneer, turning the act of living into a grueling struggle against dehydration and rot. The physical frame was under a perpetual state of siege from the elements, the poor diet of salted pork, and the sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion of manual labor. Amidst this filth, the biological imperative remained deaf to the fragility of the individual, demanding its toll in flesh and bone regardless of the mother's capacity to endure another assault on her anatomy. The economy of the frontier was built not on gold or silver, but on the visceral mess of childbirth occurring on grit-covered sheets in rooms that never felt truly warm. These delivery scenes were devoid of dignity, characterized by the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and the cloying, metallic aroma of a hemorrhage that the attending midwife could not hope to arrest. The only available respite from the agonizing tearing of muscle was a jagged swallow of cheap, low-grade whiskey that tasted more of industrial kerosene than of grain. Pain was not an obstacle to be overcome or managed, it was the very atmosphere in which these women lived, a constant, low-frequency vibration that hummed beneath every waking hour. Following the trauma of labor, there was no period of convalescence, no quiet recovery in a sterile environment to allow the internal wounds to knit. The empire could not wait for the weary, and the survival of the homestead demanded that the woman return to the churn and the stove while her body was still leaking the evidence of its latest ordeal. Many were left with permanent, hidden mutilations, prolapses and fistulas that made every step a torment and every future intimacy a source of dread. They carried these injuries in a silence that was expected of them, their suffering being a private tax paid to the public project of westward expansion and national growth. The social landscape of the 1870s was as unforgiving as the climate, a rigid hierarchy where the law of the land and the law of the church conspired to keep women in a state of perpetual vulnerability. In the hallowed halls of government, men who would never feel the quickening of a fetus or the fire of a botched delivery drafted moral codes that criminalized the very knowledge of self-preservation. Control over one's own fertility was viewed as a subversion of the natural order and a theft of the state's future resources. This political environment ensured that the woman remained a captive of her own biology, chained to the reproductive cycle by a combination of legal terror and social shaming. By the time a woman reached her 30th year, she was often a hollowed-out husk, her teeth lost to the calcium-stripping demands of multiple pregnancies and her spirit eroded by the constant fear of the next conception. The frontier did not produce the sturdy, smiling matriarchs of legend, it produced weathered, hollow-eyed survivors who looked upon the vastness of the prairie with a mixture of resentment and exhaustion. They were the invisible infantry of the Western movement, their bodies being the actual territory that was conquered, tilled, and exhausted for the benefit of a future they would likely never live to see. The expansion was a massacre of the feminine, conducted in the name of progress and piety. The prairie wind, cold and indifferent, carried the cries of the dying and the newborns alike, echoing across a terrain that cared nothing for the morality of the settlers or the agony of the mothers. Nature, acting as a dispassionate executioner, watched as women attempted to reclaim their bodies through desperate, unproven means, often with catastrophic results. The struggle for contraception was not a pursuit of modern convenience, but a frantic, bloody rebellion against a biological destiny that felt increasingly like a prison sentence. Every attempt to halt the cycle of birth was an act of high-stakes gambling where the currency was one's own life and the house always held the advantage. As the sun climbed higher over the desolate plains of 1875, it illuminated a world where the only certainty was the relentless pressure of the next generation demanding to be born. The iron rails of the locomotive might have been the veins of the nation, but the blood that filled them was drawn from the wombs of women who had no voice in the destiny they were forced to create. This was the foundational lie of the Wild West, that it was a land of freedom and new beginnings. In reality, for half the population, it was a biological labor camp where the only escape was through the grace of a quick death or the dark, dangerous secrets of the apothecary. The frontier apothecary of 1875 was a monument to human greed and biological ignorance, standing as a weathered sentinel on a muddy street choked with the waste of progress. Its windows were perpetually clouded with a thick layer of dust and soot, obscuring the rows of amber glass bottles that promised salvation but delivered only varying degrees of systematic ruin. Inside, the air was a suffocating, stagnant soup of camphor, dried belladonna, and the sharp, metallic tang of unrefined minerals, a scent that attempted to mask the underlying odor of damp rot permeating the wooden floorboards. Behind the heavy oak counter stood the merchant of these chemical illusions, a man whose fingers were often stained a sickly yellow from handling the very toxins he sold as life-altering remedies to the desperate and the damned. The labels on these bottles were masterpieces of Victorian euphemism, meticulously crafted to navigate the treacherous waters of the recently enacted Comstock laws which criminalized the dissemination of contraceptive knowledge. They spoke in a coded language of regulating the system, removing female obstructions, or restoring the monthly course, ensuring that the word abortion never tainted the sanitized surface of the glass. These so-called female regulators or Portuguese pills were marketed with a predatory precision, targeting women whose bodies were already failing under the weight of excessive childbearing and the brutal physical labor of the homestead. Each transaction was a silent pact between a profiteer and a victim, conducted in the shadows of a society that demanded infinite fertility while offering no means to sustain it. One of the primary agents of this chemical warfare was savon, derived from the crushed needles and berries of the Juniperus sabina, a plant known since antiquity for its ability to provoke a violent rebellion within the womb. To the untrained eye of a settler, it was merely an herb, but in the concentrated form of an oil or a pill, it acted as a devastating irritant that caused massive congestion of the pelvic organs. The biological mechanism was not one of gentle intervention but of a scorched earth policy, where the irritation of the intestinal and urinary tracts was so severe that the body sought to expel everything within its abdominal cavity. It was a crude, agonizing process that left the woman doubled over in cold sweats, her internal membranes weeping under the assault of a plant that cared nothing for the vessel it occupied. Compounding this botanical horror was ergot, a parasitic fungus that bloomed in the damp rot of rye fields and carried with it the terrifying legacy of St. Anthony's fire. In the hands of a cynical pharmaceutical company, this fungus was distilled into a potent extract that forced the muscles of the uterus into a series of unnatural, relentless contractions. The sensation was described by many as a jagged, rhythmic crushing, an internal grinding that felt as though the very bones of the pelvis were being forced through a mill. While it was effective at inducing the desired hemorrhage, ergot often overstayed its welcome, causing the blood vessels in the extremities to constrict so violently that gangrene would begin to blacken the fingers and toes of the unsuspecting mother. The most sinister ingredient in this alchemy of the desperate, however, was arsenic, a substance that was ubiquitous in the 19th century household and frequently added to these pills as a supposed tonic. In small, repeated doses, it was believed to improve the complexion and stimulate the appetite, but its true function in the contraceptive cocktail was that of a slow, systemic executioner. The logic of the era was as cold as the metal itself. If the mother's body could be kept in a state of near-lethal toxicity, the fragile new life within her would be the first to succumb. It was a high-stakes gamble with the nervous system, a race to see whether the fetus would wither before the mother's heart simply forgot how to beat under the chemical strain. As the weeks of consumption passed, the cumulative effect of the arsenic began to manifest in a slow, visible decomposition of the living. A woman in her early 20s, who should have been in the prime of her physical existence, would find her hair thinning and falling out in dry, brittle clumps that littered her pillow like dead grass. Her skin, once flushed with the exertion of the frontier, took on a waxy, translucent quality, eventually deepening into an earthy, jaundiced gray that signaled the gradual failure of her liver and kidneys. These were the walking ghosts of the Great Plains, women who had traded their vitality for a fleeting chance at reproductive autonomy, their bodies becoming a canvas upon which the history of their desperation was written in bile and lead. The physical decay extended to the very architecture of the mouth, as the heavy metals and caustic herbs eroded the gums and loosened the teeth within their sockets. It was not uncommon for a young wife to find her teeth rattling like dry corn in a jar, a direct result of the systemic poisoning she had endured to prevent a 10th or 11th pregnancy. The smile of a frontier woman was often a jagged ruin of blackened stumps and inflamed tissue, a sensory testament to the price of avoiding the birth bed. This dental devastation was more than a cosmetic tragedy, it was a functional death sentence in a world where the ability to chew salted pork and hardtack was the only thing standing between a settler and starvation. The economic reality of the homestead dictated this grim calculus with the cold efficiency of a ledger book. A bottle of these lethal regulators might cost $5 or $10, a significant sum representing weeks of labor, but the cost of another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, and another soul to bury was infinitely higher. At the kitchen table, under the flickering light of a tallow candle, many a woman weighed the risk of a quick death by poison against the guaranteed slow rot of a life spent in perpetual labor and poverty. The choice was never between health and sickness, but between which form of destruction was the most manageable for the survival of the remaining family unit. When the moment came to actually swallow the pill, it was an act devoid of ritual or comfort, usually performed in the pre-dawn chill of a drafty lean-to or behind the barn. The pill itself was often large, jaggedly pressed, and coated in a bitter, sugary film that dissolved instantly to reveal the acrid, burning taste of the toxins within. Almost immediately, the stomach would heave in a desperate attempt to reject the intrusion, forcing the woman to clench her jaw and fight the urge to vomit, lest she waste the expensive, life-threatening medicine. The iron-tasting saliva would pool in her mouth, and a sense of profound, icy dread would settle in the pit of her stomach as the chemicals began their journey through her bloodstream. The hours following the dosage were a descent into a private purgatory of tremors and vertigo. The arsenic and savon would begin their work, causing the heart to race with a frantic, irregular thumping that echoed in the ears like the hooves of a distant, spectral horse. A cold sweat would break across the brow, even in the depths of a Kansas winter, as the body's internal temperature regulation spiraled out of control under the influence of the fungal toxins. There were no nurses to hold a hand, no doctors to monitor the pulse, there was only the indifferent wind howling through the chinks in the logs and the silent, terrifying knowledge that one might never wake from this self-imposed sickness. If the gamble succeeded, the result was a violent, exhausting hemorrhage that could last for days, leaving the woman pale, hollowed out, and barely able to stand. She would have to conceal her agony from her children and often from a husband whose primary concern was the next day's plowing or the mending of a broken fence. She would drag her bleeding, poisoned frame across the floor to tend the hearth, her every movement a testament to the sheer, brutal resilience of a species that had learned to survive its own cure. The obstruction had been removed, the system had been regulated, but the price was a permanent loss of a piece of her soul and a significant portion of her remaining lifespan. The long-term effects of these chemical interventions were often neurological, manifesting as a persistent palsy or a dulling of the cognitive faculties that left the woman a shadow of her former self. The heavy metals would settle in the bone marrow and the brain, causing tremors that made the simplest tasks of sewing or cooking a daily humiliation. By the time many of these women reached 35, they were viewed by society as elderly crones, their stooped backs and shaking hands attributed to the general hardships of the West, rather than the specific, targeted poisoning they had inflicted upon themselves. They were the casualties of a pharmaceutical industry that flourished in the vacuum of medical ethics and the abundance of female despair. Throughout the 1880s, the profit margins of these companies remained astronomical, fueled by an endless supply of customers who had no other recourse in a world that had outlawed their safety. The advertisements continued to fill the back pages of newspapers, promising relief for the distressed, and certain success for the troubled, while the cemeteries of the frontier filled with the bodies of those for whom the relief had been permanent. There was no public outcry, no government investigation into the ingredients of these Portuguese pills, for to acknowledge the problem was to acknowledge the forbidden desire for control over the womb. The silence of the law was as lethal as the arsenic in the bottle, a calculated indifference that maintained the status quo of the expanding empire. The body of the frontier woman was thus treated as an exhausted field, one that had been over-tilled and chemically treated until the soil was sour and the harvest was bitter. She was expected to produce until she broke, and when she broke, she was expected to fix herself with the very poisons that had accelerated her decline. This was the foundational cycle of the westward movement, a relentless, biological grinding that turned the vibrant potential of a human life into the gray, ash-like residue of a civilization built on the exploitation of the intimate. As the century drew to a close, the bottles remained on the shelves, their amber glass glowing in the sunset like the eyes of a predator waiting for the next generation of the desperate. The year 1878 in Dodge City did not announce itself with the ringing of church bells or the hopeful whistle of a locomotive, but with the wet, sucking sound of boots mired in a mixture of prairie gumbo and fresh bovine excrement. In the cramped, dimly lit rooms above the saloons, where the air was thick with the gray haze of cheap tobacco and the copper tang of unwashed bodies, a different kind of commerce was taking place. When the chemical toxins of the apothecary failed to arrest the stubborn persistence of biology, the women of the frontier were forced to turn toward the cold, mechanical reality of the barrier. It was a transition from the subtle poisoning of the bloodstream to the direct, physical violation of the anatomy, a desperate attempt to fortify the gates of the body against an unwanted invasion of life. The primary tool in this struggle was often the common sea sponge, a biological relic harvested from the warm waters of the distant Caribbean and shipped across the continent to be sold as a crude instrument of salvation. In its dry state, the sponge was a harsh, calcified skeleton, as abrasive and unforgiving as a handful of desert sand. To the soiled doves of the bordellos or the weary wives in sod-roofed huts, this object represented the only shield they possessed against the relentless cycle of poverty and childbearing. It was an alien thing, a piece of a far-off ocean thrust into the dry, dusty reality of the American West, where its porous structure was expected to perform a miracle that the church and the state had strictly forbidden. Preparation of the sponge was a ritual of agonizing necessity, usually performed in the flickering shadows of a tallow candle while the rest of the world slept. The woman would soak the dry, jagged fibers in a solution of the strongest cider vinegar she could procure, or perhaps a concentrated draught of alum crystals dissolved in tepid, brackish water. The vinegar, with its high acetic acid content, was intended to create an environment so hostile that no spark of life could survive its caustic baptism. Alum, a powerful astringent, was used to pucker and contract the delicate tissues of the cervix, effectively attempting to seal the entrance to the womb through a process of chemical mummification. When the sponge, dripping with these acrid fluids, was inserted into the body, the result was not protection but a localized, internal torture. The vinegar bit into the sensitive, often already irritated membranes, causing a searing heat that radiated through the pelvis and turned every breath into a stifled groan. The abrasive texture of the sea creature's skeleton, even when dampened, acted like a fine-grained sandpaper against the living walls of the vagina, creating thousands of microscopic tears. These tiny, weeping wounds were the open doors through which the filth of the frontier, the dust of the plains, the bacteria of the unwashed bedding, and the miasma of the privy, could enter the bloodstream with terrifying ease. Over months of repeated use, the internal landscape of these women became a scarred and calloused wasteland, a territory that had been pickled and scraped into a state of chronic inflammation. The smell of vinegar and fermenting fluids would linger on their skin, a permanent olfactory mark of their desperation that no amount of cheap rosewater could fully mask. This was the vinegar rot, a condition known to the aging madams and the weary midwives but never spoken of in the polite company of the growing towns. It was a secret history of erosion, where the very act of trying to preserve one's future resulted in the slow, agonizing destruction of one's physical presence in the present. For those who lived on the absolute margins of the economy, where even the price of a sea sponge was an insurmountable barrier, the methods of contraception descended into a realm of truly primitive horror. In the isolated cabins of the high plains, where the nearest neighbor was a day's ride away and the only abundant resources were livestock and mud, women turned to the ancient, whispered lore of the European peasantry. They would gather the steaming, nitrogen-rich manure of horses or cattle from the stable floor, mixing it with a small amount of wild honey or lard to create a thick, malodorous paste. This substance, teeming with the microbial life of the animal world, was then used as a crude plug, a barrier of filth intended to block the path of conception. The logic behind such a practice was as desperate as it was scientifically illiterate, rooted in the belief that the sheer pungency and strength of the animal waste would act as a natural repellent. In reality, it was an invitation to a swift and merciless death by sepsis or tetanus. The delicate, vulnerable interior of the human body was never meant to play host to the bacterial flora of a stable, and the response was often a violent, systemic rebellion. Within days of such an application, a woman might find herself gripped by the icy tremors of a skyrocketing fever, her abdomen swelling with the pressure of a burgeoning infection that no frontier doctor, even if one could be found, had the tools to arrest. The onset of the infection was a descent into a private, sun-baked purgatory, where the victim lay on a rustling mattress of dried corn husks while the flies of the prairie gathered in thick, buzzing clouds. The smell of the room would shift from the scent of wood smoke to the cloying, sweet sickly aroma of gangrene, a sign that the tissues of the womb were literally dying while still inside the living host. The delirium would take hold, stripping away the woman's last vestiges of dignity as she shrieked at the shadows or pleaded with a god who seemed to have turned his back on the frontier. Death, when it finally arrived, was often viewed by the survivors not as a tragedy, but as a release from a biological trap that had finally snapped shut. In this environment, the act of intimacy was stripped of any veneer of romance or mutual affection, becoming instead a transaction of profound anxiety and strategic maneuvering. For the woman, the moment of physical union was shadowed by the terrifying question of whether the sponge would hold, whether the vinegar was strong enough, or whether the barrier had shifted during the exertion. The male partner, often oblivious or indifferent to the chemical and mechanical war being waged within his companion's body, remained a source of constant biological threat. Sex was not an escape from the hardships of the West, it was the very engine of those hardships, a recurring event that could derail a life with the same finality as a winter blizzard or a Cheyenne raid. The social structure of 1882 offered no sympathy for these casualties of the reproductive war. A woman who died from a botched mechanical intervention or a septic infection from a stable paste was often buried in the middle of the night, her cause of death recorded as a vague fever or female weakness. The community, built on the foundations of a rigid, patriarchal morality, preferred to look away from the bloody reality of the bedroom. The silence of the frontier was a powerful weapon of the state, ensuring that each woman felt her struggle was a private sin rather than a systemic failure of a society that demanded her labor but criminalized her safety. Nature itself, the great, indifferent executioner of the plains, offered no respite, watching with a cold, crystalline eye as these women mutilated themselves in the name of survival. The vast, unmoving sky of Kansas or Nebraska provided a stark contrast to the cramped, frantic, and dirty struggles occurring within the sod houses below. To the prairie, a woman was just another organism attempting to navigate the pressures of its environment, no more or less significant than the buffalo or the grasshopper. If her methods of survival were grotesque, it was only because the environment itself had been made so by the crushing demands of the expanding empire and the total absence of medical mercy. By the time the decade of the 1880s began to wane, the floorboards of the frontier were soaked with the evidence of this mechanical desperation. The successes were women who lived to be 40, their bodies hollowed out by acidity and their internal organs scarred beyond recognition, yet free from the burden of another mouth to feed. The failures were the nameless mounds of earth dotting the periphery of every settlement, where the wild sunflowers grew taller due to the nitrogen of the decomposing bodies beneath. This was the true cost of the Western movement, a trail of broken sponges, spilled vinegar, and the silent, necrotic remains of a generation of women who fought a war against their own fertility and lost. The expansion of the railroad and the growth of the telegraph lines brought the promise of a more connected world, but for the woman in the cabin, the isolation remained absolute. The mechanical barriers she used were a reflection of her status as an outsider in her own skin, a tenant in a biological home that she was not allowed to manage or secure. The transition from the chemical poisons of the early frontier to the mechanical horrors of the middle period was not progress, it was merely a change in the caliber of the weapon being used against the female form. The 19th century remained a long, dark corridor of physical trial, where the only light at the end was the cold, gray dawn of another day of labor and fear. As the sun set over the jagged horizon of 1885, casting long, bloody shadows across the landscape, the bottles of alum and the jars of vinegar remained on the shelves, waiting for the next night's work. The economy of the West continued to grind forward, fueled by the invisible sacrifices of those who dared to dream of a life that was not defined by the relentless, crushing weight of the next generation. The Wild West was a land of ghosts, and many of those ghosts were created not by the bullet or the noose, but by the desperate, frantic use of a common sea sponge in a world that offered no other way out. The social landscape of the 1870s was a frozen expanse of ideological cruelty, every bit as treacherous and unyielding as the blizzards that scoured the Dakotas. While the pioneers battled the physical elements of the frontier, a different kind of frost was settling over the legal and moral architecture of the nation, emanating from the humid, wood-paneled halls of Washington. In the year 1873, the United States Congress codified a profound distrust of the female body through the passage of the Comstock Act, a legislative guillotine designed to sever women from the most basic knowledge of their own biology. This law was not merely a matter of Victorian prudery, it was a calculated assertion of state ownership over the reproductive capacity of the citizenry, transforming the womb into a public utility and its control into a criminal act. The state functioned as a cold, indifferent leviathan, an entity that viewed the human population not as individuals with inherent rights, but as a vast reservoir of raw energy and potential labor. For a growing empire hungry for railroads, mines, and infantry, every prevented conception was seen as a theft of national wealth and a sabotage of manifest destiny. The politicians and moralists who championed these restrictions understood that a woman with control over her fertility was a woman who could demand a place in the world beyond the domestic sphere. Consequently, the right to prevent a pregnancy was rebranded as a form of social and spiritual treason, a rebellion against the very foundations of a society that required an endless supply of bodies to fuel its expansionist engine. To enforce this biological conscription, the United States Postal Service was weaponized into a secular inquisition, granted the authority to peer into the private correspondence of every household in the land. Anthony Comstock, the fanatical architect of this surveillance state, viewed the post office as a front line in a holy war against obscenity, a term he conveniently expanded to include any pamphlet, letter, or diagram concerning contraception. Clerks in dusty sorting rooms across the country became the gatekeepers of survival, intercepting the life-saving advice shared between sisters or the discreet advertisements of distant apothecaries. Information that could have prevented the death of a mother was treated with the same vitriol as the most depraved pornography, ensuring that ignorance remained the primary tool of social control. The suppression of safe medical knowledge did not eliminate the desperate need for contraception, it merely drove it into the arms of more lethal and clandestine alternatives. When the books were burned and the pamphlets seized, the vacuum was filled by the whispers of the desperate and the predatory suggestions of the uninformed. In the absence of legitimate science, women on the fringes of the civilized world were forced to experiment with substances that were more at home in a blacksmith's forge or an alchemist's laboratory than a human body. The law had effectively declared that it was better for a woman to be poisoned by her own hand than to be educated by a doctor's word, a cynical trade-off that the state was more than willing to accept. One of the most terrifying inhabitants of the frontier medicine cabinet during this era was mercury bichloride, known colloquially and ominously as corrosive sublimate. This substance was a heavy, silvery powder that promised to sterilize the interior of the body with the same ruthless efficiency it used to preserve timber or treat the most virulent sores of syphilis. In the 1880s, many women turned to douching with a diluted solution of this chemical, believing that its caustic power was the only thing capable of stopping the relentless tide of their own fertility. They mixed the lethal salts in chipped porcelain basins, the water turning a deceptive, shimmering gray as the mercury dissolved, ready to be introduced into the most delicate tissues of their being. The immediate physical sensation of a mercury douche was one of a localized, chemical fire that seemed to scorch the very core of the body. The corrosive sublimate did not discriminate between the reproductive cells it was meant to destroy and the living membranes that housed them, causing a violent shedding of the internal lining and leaving behind a raw, weeping landscape. Women would endure this agony in the silence of their bedrooms, clutching the bedposts as the chemical burned its way into their bloodstream through the thousands of microscopic tears it created. It was a ritual of self-mutilation performed under the guise of hygiene, a desperate attempt to find safety in the heart of a silver poison. Once the mercury entered the circulatory system, it began a slow, methodical dismantling of the woman's nervous system, a process that was as inevitable as it was horrific. The heavy metal possessed a particular affinity for the brain and the spinal cord, settling into the fatty tissues and beginning a lifelong campaign of neurological sabotage. This was the mercurial erethism, a condition that transformed once vibrant pioneers into trembling, paranoid shadows of their former selves. The initial symptoms were often subtle, a sudden, irrational shyness, a flickering irritability, or a persistent metallic taste in the mouth that no amount of coffee or lye soap could ever fully wash away. As the toxicity deepened, the physical manifestations of the poisoning became impossible to ignore, marking the woman as a pariah in her own community. Her gums would swell and turn a bruised, necrotic purple, eventually receding until the teeth stood out like white stones in a drying riverbed. Chronic salivation, a hallmark of mercury poisoning, forced many women to carry cloths to constantly dab at their mouths, their dignity eroding alongside their health. The shaking palsy would set in, a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor of the hands that made the essential tasks of the frontier, threading a needle, kneading bread, or holding a child, an exercise in frustration and public shame. The psychological toll of the corrosive sublimate was perhaps its most cruel legacy, creating a population of frontier ghosts who haunted their own homes. The mercury induced vivid, terrifying hallucinations and a profound sense of dread that the vast, empty prairie only served to amplify. A woman might find herself screaming at the wind or cowering from imaginary intruders, her mind fractured by the very substance she had used to protect her future. To the outside observer, these women were simply victims of pioneer madness or the isolation of the West, their condition attributed to the harsh environment rather than the systemic poisoning mandated by a society that had outlawed their survival. In the small, sod-roofed towns of Kansas and Nebraska, the sight of a woman in her late 20s with the tremors of a centenarian and the vacant stare of the insane became a common, if unspoken, tragedy. These were the collateral casualties of the Comstock era, women who had been forced to choose between the certain ruin of excessive childbearing and the chemical execution of the mercury bottle. The state, having achieved its goal of suppressing the obscene information of birth control, looked away from the resulting carnage with a cold, bureaucratic indifference. The labor continued, the empire grew, and the silver poison continued to flow through the veins of the mothers of the nation, a hidden tax paid in sanity and flesh. The irony of this great democracy was that its expansion was built upon the bodies of those it systematically disenfranchised and endangered. Every mile of railroad track and every new settlement was shadowed by the presence of women who were losing their minds and their lives to the corrosive power of the heavy metals. The legal framework of the 1870s had created a world where the only way for a woman to exercise agency over her own life was to engage in a slow-motion suicide. This was the dark reality behind the curtains of the Victorian parlor, a landscape of chemical burns, loosening teeth, and a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight on the chest of the frontier. By the time the 1890s arrived, the legacy of the Comstock Act was etched into the very bones of the generation. The cemeteries were filled with women who had died of dropsy or general decline, their true cause of death hidden beneath layers of social respectability and legal terror. The mercury remained in the soil and in the skeletons of the dead, a permanent record of an era that valued the quantity of life far more than its quality. The Wild West was won not just by the courage of the settlers, but by the systematic sacrifice of the internal health of its women, a process that turned the American dream into a metallic, fever dream nightmare for those who lived it in the flesh. The cold leviathan of the state continued to demand its tribute of blood and labor, seemingly unbothered by the fact that the foundations of its empire were beginning to rot from the inside out. The woman in the isolated cabin, shaking with a mercurial chill as she looked out over the endless grass, was the ultimate symbol of the frontier's cynical progress. She was the vessel that had been used, poisoned, and discarded in the name of a civilization that could not bear to speak the truth about the cost of its own existence. The silver trail of the mercury was the true map of the West, a path of toxicity and despair that led straight into the heart of the 20th century, carrying the ghosts of the Comstock era with it. By the middle of the 1880s, the iron pulse of the Industrial Revolution had supposedly reached the furthest outposts of the frontier, bringing with it the shiny promises of vulcanized progress. In the sleek, illustrated catalogs of the eastern cities, new inventions known as rubber pessaries or womb veils were marketed as the height of modern hygienic achievement. These objects, cast from the blackened, sulfurous gum of the caoutchouc tree, promised a mechanical salvation from the unending cycle of biological labor. However, for the woman living in a sod house on the edges of the Nebraska Territory, these items remained as distant and mythical as the gilded carriages of New York. The price of a single rubber cap was often equivalent to the cost of a winter's supply of flour, making the luxury of a manufactured barrier an impossibility for the wives of the poor. The rubber itself was a temperamental and treacherous material, often sold in an unvulcanized or poorly cured state that reacted poorly to the humid, acidic environment of the human interior. In the sweltering heat of a Kansas July, these expensive devices would become tacky and soft, losing their structural integrity and emitting a sharp, chemical stench that suggested the presence of industrial rot. For the few who could afford them, the modern solution often turned into a gummy, adhesive nightmare that clung to the delicate tissues of the cervix, requiring painful and forceful removal. It was a cruel irony of the era that even when science attempted to intervene on behalf of the female form, it did so with a crude, industrial clumsiness that treated the body as a test site for unstable polymers. Denied access to the clean, manufactured tools of the wealthy, the common woman of the West was forced to look toward the scrap heaps and the toolboxes of her own homestead for a solution. The transition from chemical poisons to mechanical obstruction saw the birth of a terrifying folk engineering, where the materials of survival were repurposed into instruments of internal fortification. Scraps of leather, bits of seasoned wood, and even small discs of lead or copper were fashioned into homemade plugs by hands more accustomed to skinning rabbits or mending harness gear. These devices were hewn from the harsh, inorganic world of the frontier, possessing a cold and unyielding geometry that was fundamentally at odds with the soft, vulnerable architecture of the living womb. A leather pessary was perhaps the most common and the most insidious of these improvised barriers, often cut from the tongue of a discarded boot or a piece of heavy rain. Although the leather was oiled to provide a semblance of suppleness, it remained a porous and biological material that had been treated with caustic tanning agents like lye and chromium. Once inserted, the leather would begin to absorb the internal fluids of the body, swelling and darkening as it became a sanctuary for every species of bacteria that thrived in the damp darkness. Within 48 hours, the shield would transform into a saturated sponge of decay, leaching the bitter residues of the tannery directly into the woman's bloodstream and creating a localized site of chronic, weeping infection. Wooden plugs were even more brutal in their simplicity, often whittled from scrap pine or oak by a woman who had no other choice but to carve her own way out of a destiny of childbearing. The wood was rarely sanded to a truly smooth finish, and even the smallest, microscopic splinter could act as a jagged anchor within the vaginal walls. As the wood absorbed the natural moisture of the body, it would expand slightly, putting a constant, dull pressure on the surrounding nerves and causing a persistent, radiating ache in the small of the back. If left too long, the wood would begin to soften and fray, its fibers intertwining with the living tissue until the distinction between the tree and the woman became a bloody, inseparable mess. Metal discs, fashioned from copper or lead, offered a cold and heavy alternative that carried the additional threat of systemic heavy metal poisoning. A copper coin or a hand-beaten lead sheet might seem like an effective physical block, but the chemistry of the body would slowly corrode the surface, releasing a green and toxic oxidation into the delicate environment. The cold weight of the metal was a constant reminder of the intrusion, a literal stone within the garden of the body that made every step a labor of endurance. These metal obstructions were the most likely to cause a catastrophic injury, their sharp edges capable of slicing through the cervical lining during the physical exertion of daily chores or the forced intimacy of the bedroom. The greatest terror of these homemade devices, however, was the possibility of them becoming lost within the dark, anatomical folds of the interior. In the absence of medical knowledge and proper lighting, a woman might find that a leather plug or a wooden disc had migrated beyond the reach of her own fingers, disappearing into the void like a ship lost in a storm. The panic that followed was a cold, suffocating dread, a realization that she was now carrying a piece of foreign matter that she could not retrieve. Without a way to extract the object, the body would begin its slow and inevitable process of rejection, surrounding the intruder with a wall of white cells and fluid that soon turned into a throbbing, internal abscess. As the abscess grew, the smell of the bedroom would change, taking on the cloying, nauseating aroma of biological rot that no amount of ventilation could disperse. The fever would arrive like a thief in the night, bringing with it a shivering, bone-deep cold and a delirium that blurred the lines between the cabin walls and the endless plains outside. The pain was no longer a dull ache but a sharp, rhythmic stabbing that signaled the onset of a profound systemic collapse. In the isolated communities of 1888, there were no specialists to turn to. The only doctor available was often the local veterinarian or a blacksmith whose hands were more familiar with the anatomy of a mule than that of a woman. The removal of a lost and necrotic device was a scene of butchery that the history books have conveniently forgotten, performed on a kitchen table without the mercy of anesthesia. The healer would use whatever tools were at hand, heavy pliers, a hooked wire used for cleaning pipes, or a set of long-handled tongs, to probe and scrape for the offending object. The screams of the patient were drowned out by the howling of the prairie wind or muffled by a rag soaked in the same kerosene-flavored whiskey that served as the only antiseptic. Many women died on those tables, their hearts failing under the sheer trauma of the procedure, while others were left with permanent, weeping fistulas that rendered them social and physical outcasts for the remainder of their shortened lives. The society that demanded these sacrifices was a cold and calculating machine, viewing the female body as a mere commodity in the great enterprise of Western expansion. Just as the railroad companies viewed the wooden ties beneath the iron rails as an expendable and replaceable resource, the architects of the frontier viewed the mothers of the nation as a fleshy substrate for the demographic growth of the empire. A woman was a biological engine to be run until her parts were worn thin and her gears were stripped, at which point she was quietly discarded in favor of the next generation of laborers. The expansion was not a clean march of progress, but a grinding, industrial process that used the lives of women as the lubricant for its gears. The comparison to the great buffalo slaughters of the era is not a hyperbolic one. Both involved the systematic exploitation and waste of a biological resource in the name of economic dominance. Thousands of bison were stripped of their hides and left to rot in the sun, their bones later gathered to be ground into fertilizer for the very soil the settlers were tilling. In a similar fashion, the women of the frontier were stripped of their health and their agency, their bodies used to produce the crop of the future before they were buried in shallow, nameless graves that were eventually leveled by the wind. The civilization of the American West was not built on a foundation of gold, but on a thick, dark layer of female suffering and the biological wreckage of the reproductive wars. If one were to excavate the earth around the old homesteads of 1890, they would find more than just rusted nails and broken pottery. They would find the physical evidence of this mechanical desperation. Small, unrecognizable fragments of carved wood, decayed leather, and corroded copper lie buried alongside the shattered pelvic bones of those who used them. These artifacts are the silent witnesses to a history of pain that has no voice in the national mythos, a chronicle of a war fought in the most intimate spaces of the human experience. The taming of the West was, in reality, a brutal and unceasing campaign to colonize the female interior, turning the source of life into a site of industrial-grade tragedy. By the time the sun set on the 19th century, the trail of the westward movement was marked by the white markers of the dead, many of whom were victims of their own attempts at self-preservation. The census records of the time show a high turnover of wives on the frontier, a demographic churn that spoke of the lethal nature of the environment and the desperate measures taken within it. A man might go through 3 or 4 helpmates in his quest to establish a ranch, each woman leaving behind a few survivors and a legacy of internal scarring before being claimed by the fever or the rot. This was the true engine of the empire, a continuous, bloody recycling of the feminine form in the service of a future that had no place for their memories. The final irony of this era was that the very civilization that claimed to be protecting the sanctity of the home was the one that made that home a place of chemical and mechanical horror. The laws that forbade the clean and safe distribution of contraceptives were the same laws that forced women to put leather and lead into their bodies. The state, in its infinite and cynical wisdom, chose the messy and agonizing death of its subjects over the perceived moral danger of their enlightenment. The Wild West was won through a process of systematic attrition, where the survival of the nation was prioritized over the survival of the individual woman, leaving a legacy of bitterness that was as deep and as enduring as the prairie itself. As the decade drew to a close, the bottles of vinegar were put away and the handmade plugs were buried, but the damage was already woven into the genetic and social fabric of the coming century. The women who survived were the ones whose bodies had been hardened into stone by the experience, their eyes reflecting the cold, gray light of a reality that offered no comfort and no apology. They were the architects of the new world, but their tools had been the poisons and the scrap metal of the old, and the structure they built was forever shadowed by the smell of the infirmary and the silence of the graveyard. The history of the West is a history of flesh, and that flesh was always, and inevitably, expendable. The sun that set over the high plains in the year 1899 did not illuminate a land of triumphant freedom, but rather a vast, open-air charnel house where the ghosts of a generation of women wandered in silence. The great westward expansion, so often depicted in the sanitized hues of a heroic tapestry, was in truth a brutal, biological siege conducted against the very bodies that were expected to populate it. As the century drew to its weary close, the landscape was littered with the remnants of this reproductive war, shards of amber glass that once held toxic tonics, the calcified remains of sea sponges buried in the alkaline soil, and the countless, nameless mounds of earth where the victims of the female regulators lay in their final, chemical sleep. The conquest of the West was not a victory of the human spirit over the wilderness, but a systematic, industrial-scale crushing of the feminine anatomy in the service of an insatiable imperial hunger. When one gazes upon the surviving daguerreotypes of those pioneer women, their faces appear like slabs of weathered granite, etched with lines that speak of a hardship far deeper than the mere toil of the plow. Behind that vacant, haunted stare lay the hidden reality of chronic, agonizing inflammation, a persistent, throbbing pain in the pelvis that never subsided from the age of 20 until the grave. This was the silent legacy of the vinegar rot, the internal scarring caused by years of caustic douching and the mechanical trauma of improvised barriers. For these women, the glory of the frontier was a series of feverish nights spent clutching a stained mattress, praying that the latest self-inflicted intervention would either work or end their suffering entirely. Freedom, in the context of the 1880s, was a myth that dissolved the moment it encountered the cold, uncompromising reality of the menstrual cycle. The economy of the frontier was a parasite that fed on the vitality of the womb, treating the reproductive capacity of the female population as a raw material to be extracted until the source was depleted. Just as the gold mines of California were hollowed out and abandoned, the bodies of these women were used as biological engines to produce the next generation of laborers, soldiers, and settlers. The state, through the draconian silence of the Comstock laws, ensured that this extraction remained uninterrupted by the interference of safe medical knowledge. Every child born into the mud of a sod house was a victory for the Census Bureau and a potential defeat for the mother whose skeletal structure was already brittle from the calcium-stripping demands of a dozen previous pregnancies. The expansion was a massacre of the intimate, a process where the preservation of the nation required the systematic destruction of the individual woman's physical sovereignty. The pharmaceutical industry of the 19th century flourished in this environment of state-mandated ignorance, growing fat on the proceeds of female desperation and biological terror. The bottles of Portuguese Pills and monthly regulators were the actual currency of the westward movement, traded in the shadows of the general store for the price of a winter's survival. These poisons, laden with arsenic, mercury, and lead, were the silent executioners that haunted the homesteads, turning the blood of the mothers into a toxic soup that eroded their nerves and rotted their teeth. There was a profound, biting irony in the fact that the very substances sold as liberators were the ones that ensured the woman remained a prisoner of her own failing health, her mind a fractured landscape of mercurial hallucinations and lead-induced tremors. The mechanical horrors, the leather plugs, the wooden discs, and the copper coins, represented the final, desperate stage of this internal colonization, where the materials of the workshop were turned against the flesh. These objects, lost and forgotten within the folds of the anatomy, created a geography of hidden necrosis that no frontier doctor could map or cure. The smell of the era was not the scent of fresh pine or mountain air, it was the cloying, nauseating aroma of internal abscesses and the sharp, metallic tang of the corrosive sublimate used in a vain attempt at sterilization. This was the sensory reality of the Great Migration, a trail of biological wreckage that stretched from the banks of the Missouri to the shores of the Pacific, hidden beneath the floorboards of the cabins and the petticoats of the pioneers. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the census records provided a ledger of this carnage, a cold accounting of the wives who had been replaced 3 or 4 times over in the quest to establish a single ranch. A man might own 500 head of cattle and 1,000 acres of land, but his property was built upon a foundation of broken women who had been used up and discarded like worn-out machinery. The social hierarchy of the frontier viewed this turnover as a natural consequence of the harsh environment, a convenient euphemism that absolved the state and the church of their role in the mass poisoning and mutilation of the female population. The Wild West was won by a process of attrition where the only measure of success was the quantity of life left standing after the chemicals and the scrap metal had done their work. The legacy of this era is not one of triumph, but of a profound and enduring trauma that was woven into the very fabric of the American identity. The silence that was forced upon these women, the requirement that they suffer their female weaknesses, in secret, created a culture of shame and bodily alienation that would take generations to unravel. The history of the West is a chronicle of a war against the flesh, where the primary battlefield was not the open range or the mountain pass, but the dark, vulnerable interior of the human body. Every town that rose from the dust was baptized in the vinegar and blood of those who tried to reclaim their lives from a biological destiny they never chose. Civilization was the ultimate virus, and the mothers of the frontier were the hosts that were consumed to ensure its survival. The frontier graveyard, with its tilted wooden markers and overgrown weeds, stands as the final, honest monument to this history, far more accurate than any bronze statue in a town square. In the year 1905, the wind still hissed through the dry grass over the graves of women who had died at 24, their bodies riddled with the residues of the apothecary's trade. There is no heroism in these deaths, only the grim, unvarnished reality of a struggle for autonomy that was met with the full, crushing weight of legal and chemical violence. The manifest destiny was a philosophy of the graveyard, a belief system that viewed the sacrifice of the female form as a necessary price for the realization of a continental dream. The reality of the West was not the gunfight at high noon, it was the slow, rhythmic dripping of a mercury douche in a dark room while the rest of the world looked away. Nature, acting as the indifferent judge of this epoch, provided no sanctuary and no mercy for the casualties of the reproductive war. The vast, empty sky of Wyoming remained a cold, blue vault that offered no answers to the screams of the septic or the pleas of the poisoned. To the earth, the woman was merely another organic deposit, her bones eventually returning to the dust alongside the buffalo and the prairie dog, her life struggle reduced to a few calcium deposits in the dirt. This was the ultimate victory of entropy over the grand designs of the empire, a transformation of human suffering into the gray, anonymous matter of the plains. The history of the West is a story of consumption, where the spirit was the first thing to be sacrificed and the body was the last thing to be left behind. The final irony of the story is that the very methods intended to grant a woman a future were the ones that most effectively robbed her of it. The sea sponge that was meant to provide a path to independence became the vector for a lethal infection. The arsenic that was meant to regulate the cycle became the agent of a slow, systemic collapse. This was the cynical joke of the frontier, that the only way to avoid the biological trap of the state was to step into the chemical trap of the market. The woman was caught in a pincer movement between a government that demanded her fertility and a pharmaceutical industry that profited from her fear. In this landscape of total exploitation, the only true freedom was the freedom to choose the manner of one's own physical decline. Today, the prairie has largely reclaimed the sites of these old tragedies, the sunflowers and the sagebrush hiding the locations of the sod houses where the vinegar rot once reigned. The legends of the Wild West have been polished and sanitized for public consumption, the blood and the stench removed to make room for a narrative of courage and progress. But the cynical historian knows that the foundations of this world are built on a layer of leather plugs and mercury salts, a secret history of pain that remains as potent as it is ignored. The taming of the West was not a conquest of the land, but a brutal, unfinished war against the biological reality of the human condition, a conflict where there were no heroes, only survivors and the countless, silent dead. As the light fades over the modern horizon, the echoes of this struggle still vibrate in the social and political tremors of the present. The cold leviathan of the state has not lost its appetite for control, and the pharmaceutical merchants still peddle their illusions to the desperate and the uninformed. The story of frontier contraception is not a relic of the past, but a recurring nightmare of a civilization that has never truly made peace with the flesh. The winner of the West was never the pioneer, the cowboy, or the lawman, it was the relentless, indifferent process of entropy that turned the most intimate acts of survival into a landscape of metallic sorrow and bitter, unavailing ash. The Wild West was, and remains, a monument to the expendability of the human form in the grand, heartless ledger of history.